done, some of the work I've done, some of the work that's ongoing, a lot about their status in Maryland, and some of the conservation efforts and some of the other people that are currently involved with them. And I would like to thank the Natural History Society for having me. I'd like to, the Herp Club for having me. It's always great to be talking to folks who are enthusiastic about the same things that I'm enthusiastic about. And for all you folks out there in the ether world, thanks for listening. This talk is going to have some fairly easy listening stuff, and there is some hard data in here. So I'm just preparing you. I'm gonna have some data slides because I'm a scientist, and we can't help it. It's in our DNA. Well, let's start with bog turtles. As was said earlier, the bog turtle is one of the smallest turtles in the world, and in Maryland. It has its maximum length of about 4 inches. And let me see how to use this thing. Here we go. It's primarily known for this neck patch, this usually orange neck patch, but occasionally it's white, or this is kind of a pinkish white. And I'm going to have some really interesting photographs at the end of my talk showing some specimens that we've caught over the last 30 years that have white neck patches, which is kind of neat. Anyways, some other things about the bog turtle is, at least younger turtles, these growth annuli on their top shell. The top shell is called the carapace, and these are called scutes. The scales on here are called scutes, and they're kind of piled up like dinner plates, and they really make this, at least in younger animals, an absolutely gorgeous animal. And sometimes we have these rays, sunburst rays, coming out of each scute. And this particular animal was extraordinary. That was from a Harford County, Maryland site. Male and female bog turtles can be told apart the same way we tell apart most other turtle species. The males, the bottom shell, which is called the plastron, is concave. It's like this, so when he's riding on the female, he doesn't fall off as easily. The female's bottom shell, the plastron, is flat. The male has this long, thick tail, and the cloacal opening is out here. The female has a really narrow, small, short tail, and the cloacal opening is within the margin of the shell. There's a couple other minor characteristics, but those are the main ones we can tell the difference. Males are slightly bigger than females, but it takes a really, really big sample size to prove that. Generally, they're considered to be the same size compared to some of our other aquatic turtles, where usually the females are a lot larger than the males, though that's not always true. Its habitat are wet sedge meadows in Maryland anyways, or what we call fens. These are groundwater fed wetlands that are primarily dominated by grasses, sedges, and rushes, what we call graminoids. And the pH of these is slightly acidic to circumneutral. In Maryland, tend to be just slightly acidic. And so water is coming up through seeps and springs into these sites. And in the winter, it might look like this. This is one of the primary plants, the tussock sedge, that we find in a lot of our bog turtle wetlands in Maryland. And water flows through sheet flow, very, very slow sheet flow through the wetland. We look at the substrate, really it's muck in the wetland. Bog turtles are semi-aquatic. When they're trying to escape us when we're looking for them or escape a predator, they go straight down into the mud. They're really good at digging into the mud, but they also have tunnel systems through these wetlands. In fact, one way we catch them is we run our hand down at the tunnels and feel around and catch bog turtles, or sometimes catch other things like snapping turtles, which is always a lot of fun. And of course, bog turtles sometimes in parts of the wetland where the water is lower, you can see their tracks, and sometimes we'll follow their tracks, and we might get lucky and find a turtle at the end of those tracks. So these specific soil types are either organic or mineral soils. Now, if we look at this on the landscape, and this is from David Lee and Butch Norton's 1996 publication, this is a valley in Maryland, and a lot of times these valleys where bog turtle wetlands are, in Maryland anyways, are underlain with marble. And marble is basically metamorphosed limestone, and as it decays, as it breaks down, it releases some slightly alkaline particles into the soil and into the water, and that helps buffer acids, and so that's why we get those distinctive fins. And if we look at these wetlands, you can have one isolated wetland, or you can have a system of wetlands that tend to be headwater wetlands. And these all together, if all 5 of these were occupied by bog turtles, or even if just a couple of them were, this would be called a metapopulation. And we have a lot of these in Maryland. But one of the problems we run into, and we're going to be talking about this in a little bit more detail later, is road systems often go right through these. And if they're a road that is high volume road, and there's no way for turtles to cross over it without crossing on the road, they become really fragmenting mechanisms, and they really isolate bog turtles. In fact, you're going to see that we have a lot of bog turtle populations in Maryland, but that's really because they're so fragmented by roads. If we didn't have the road systems, we'd have a lot less, but they'd be a lot healthier. So historically, before we colonized North America, woodland bison and elk played a big role in maintaining these open, grassy wetlands through their grazing activity. Beaver also played a role. After these were all wiped out at the turn of the last century, as we came over here, our cattle and other types of livestock kind of took the same ecological role as these grazing animals. And so the grazing activity of cattle and sheep and goats and things like that has helped maintain these sites. You know, we often hear bad things about grazing, and there certainly are some problems with grazing, including all the poop, as it were, and the increased nutrients that go into a wetland. But there actually is a lot, and that poop was a scientific term, by the way. Anyways, there is a lot of good that comes from the grazing activity, and even the activity of hoofs cutting through some of the vegetation, the root mats. So there's low to moderate grazing is actually a good thing for these wetlands. So besides bog turtles, there's a whole bunch of really, really cool plants and animals that occur in these sites. And I'm just going to point out a couple of them, some that really kind of tickle my fancy. One is Canada burnet. This is a Maryland state threatened species, and it is an ice age relic species. These wetlands tend to be little cold pockets. They really hold the cold in the late winter, early spring. And this is a species that really likes that type of habitat. And in July and August, it puts up these fairly tall, about 5 to 6 foot tall flowering stalks that are covered with these fine yellow, white flowers. It really looks, it's really a cold prairie type species. So it's really kind of interesting and rare. And most of the sites in Maryland, not all, but most of the sites are found in bog turtle type wetlands. Another a state endangered plant, the scarlet Indian paintbrush, is known from only a couple of sites in Maryland. One of them is a site in Carroll County where it's actually growing in a little upland island surrounded by bog turtle wetland. It's just a really unique situation. I did a lot of work early in my career out west, and I'd always thought of Indian paintbrush as a desert type species. That tends to be where I saw it. So it was very interesting and strange to find it in Maryland and at a bog turtle site. One of the coolest animals that we find in bog turtle wetlands is the Baltimore checker spot. This is Maryland state butterfly, and a really interesting part of its life history and the story of it is that the larval host plant for that is white turtlehead, Chelone glabra, which is, it's kind of funny if you think about it. Here's a butterfly that's primarily found in bog turtle wetlands, and its prime feeding for the caterpillars is white turtleheads. That's really kind of cool. And there are a lot of efforts going on in Maryland to restore Baltimore checker spots, but to not only bog turtle wetlands, but to other areas. And part of that is planting white turtlehead. We actually have been involved in some of that in Harford County. One of the other really cool insects that isn't all that rare that I find in bog turtle wetlands, and it's found in some other wetland types too, is the phantom cranefly. These things float around like snowflakes, except they're zebra. They're white and black, and so they're just really an interesting critter. Snakes. One of the most interesting snakes that we have in Maryland, and possibly one of the more interesting snakes in the world, is the queen snake, Regina septemvittata. And this snake, which is distantly related to garter snakes, feeds only on crayfish, and not only on crayfish, but only on crayfish that are molting. Now, I have a picture here of a rusty crayfish, which is a non-native crayfish that's become established in Maryland, and there's a story behind this. So I'm at a bog turtle wetland in Carroll County about, maybe 12 years ago, and there's a little about 8 to 10 inch wide rivulet going through it, and the water is maybe about 8 inches deep, 10 inches deep in that. And I noticed some movement in it, and I look over and I see this snake slithering up in the water. And all of a sudden, I see it drive onto land with something in its mouth, and I realize this is a queen snake and it's feeding. And I'd always read that they fed on crayfish that were molting. And so I had to go over there, and being the scientist, I had to take away the food from the snake. And so this is that very snake, and this is that very crayfish, and it was a rusty crayfish. And it's kind of interesting because when I first started doing bog turtle work, I really thought that this was a really rare snake and was really concerned about its conservation. And while there is certainly some conservation concern for it, it seems to be one of our native species that is adapted to increased prey availability through this rusty crayfish. And rusty crayfish have caused a lot of problems in our stream systems with native crayfish communities. But it is interesting how some of our other native species are able to adapt to that and take advantage of this prey resource. Another great example in Maryland would be the northern map turtle, which is a state endangered turtle. And zebra mussels have come into Maryland through the Susquehanna River. And there's some both above and below the Conowingo Dam. And the map turtles, some of the map turtles have shifted their diet to these zebra mussels. So it's not without precedent that a native species would shift its diet over to a non-native one. Some of the really interesting salamanders we find at these bog turtle wetlands. Northern red salamander is the most common salamander we find at bog turtle wetlands. A lot of times we find these really old individuals, which this picture is not of an old individual. The old individuals are really purple. These black dots are diffused. They're really kind of ugly and they're giant. And you're kind of like, what the heck is this? Because they don't look as orange and as black spotted with a golden eye as you see here in this. This is a middle-aged northern red salamander. Instead, they're just these huge purple looking things. They're pretty wild. The second most common salamander at these sites is probably the four-toed salamander. And it's called the four-toed salamander because it only has 4 toes on its rear feet. But if you were to flip it over, it's our only salamander that's got a milky white belly with little black dots, but it's just a milky white belly. And it's actually more common around vernal pools, if you know what those are, those spring pools that in the winter fill up with water, and they're really important for breeding for things like spotted salamanders and wood frogs. And you often find four-toed salamanders just in the edge of those wetlands where it's dry, but in mossy areas. The northern two-line salamander is one of our 2 most common stream salamanders in Maryland, and it can actually survive in fairly polluted streams, but it is also fairly common in some of the headwater streams that emanate from these bog turtle wetlands. And then last but not least, probably my favorite salamander of all time, the long-tailed salamander has this extremely long tail and these chevron stripes. And we only find this in bog turtle wetlands that have really the most cleanest water and really some of the neatest sites. Some of the other animals, pickle frogs are probably the most common frog we find at bog turtle wetlands. And these can be confused with leopard frogs, but instead of circles, they kind of have oblong squares. And the thing to look for to help identify these is the inside of their thighs and their groin is yellow. And they tend to have this tan overall look. And their call sounds like snoring, someone snoring. Snore. Oops, sorry about that. Can you folks still hear me out there? Okay. The American toad is the most common toad we find in these wetlands. And here's a pair in Amplexus. Yeah, I knocked it. There we go. I knocked it out of whack there. I'm kind of an active speaker. Anyways, American toads are a really common species, and they're breeding right now. They have this long bird-like trill that it goes on and on and on. and they lay these string-like egg masses. We're seeing a lot of them right now. Snapping turtle, our good old snapping turtle, really a prehistoric customer. A lot of people are afraid of them, but they're really a really amazing animal. Their life history, I could talk about them for days. We find a lot of them, and you know, it's interesting. We're reaching down in the mud for these bog turtles, and I hate to say it, but I'm probably a good 8 to 10 times in my life I've put my hand on the head of a really big snapping turtle, and I never got bit by one. However, doing freshwater mussel surveys, reaching underneath the stream bank, I did get bit by a really small one. I still have a pretty bad scar from it. So you don't want to get bit by that. Last but not least, from the turtle standpoint, bog turtles share their wetlands often with spotted turtles. Spotted turtles tend to be in some of the deeper pool areas of a bog turtle wetland. And there is actually occasionally some hybridization between these two. Back about 15 years ago, bog turtles their Latin name was Clemys muhlenbergii, and the taxonomists kicked bog turtles out of the same genus as spotted turtles. We still consider them a cousin species to spotted turtles, which themselves have a lot of conservation concern. So let's go back to the bog turtle. If we look at their global range is in the eastern United States. They're found in 12 states. The northern population, which is federally threatened in 1997, they occur in New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. They've been extirpated from western Pennsylvania. This population up in the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes area are all these big, huge floating bogs. They're completely different systems. The turtles are very small because their season is very shortened. And then we have the southern population, and most of the southern population is in North Carolina, but there are some pretty good populations in southwestern Virginia, and then they barely get into Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina, just barely in there. A lot of the sites in this part of the range are in calcareous fens. These are wetlands that are kind of similar to ours, but they're underlain by limestone. And so it's really soluble, and it's because it's not metamorphic, it's really soluble. And so a lot of the plant species are more alkaline loving species. And then down here in the mountains of North Carolina, the populations are in these big high mountain bogs. And then the ones in the Piedmont are more like the ones we find in Maryland and Pennsylvania. If we look at Maryland, Herb Harris published his opus on the distribution of reptiles and amphibians in Maryland back in '75. And these are the records he had in this specimen reporter that really wasn't a record. And you can see they're found in Carroll, Baltimore, Harford, and Cecil counties in Maryland. And then from 2010 to 2014, DNR, the Natural History Society, and a whole lot of citizen scientists, including, I'm hoping many of you folks who are out there in the listening audience, took part in this effort. It was the Maryland Amphibian and Reptile Atlas Project. And you can see that the range from when this was published in 2018 compared to Harris was pretty similar. They're gone now from Elk Neck, and there's a few sites in Baltimore County they're gone from, but at least the overall range of the species hasn't changed much, even though maybe the numbers have changed. So let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the basic life history of bog turtles. They're a long-lived species. They live 35, 55 years. I have some animals that I marked back in 1992, 93. They were too old to age. They were worn back then, and so they're probably in their late 20s or even mid 30s back in 92. Well, I'm still catching those animals. So those animals are probably in their early 60s, would be my guess. One of them, in fact, has been missing his foot, and he's got bare bone that's been sticking out for at least the last 25 years, and he's doing fine. It's amazing what they can put up. Like many of our turtles, they have delayed sexual maturity. The females aren't sexually mature until they're 8 to 10 years old, and so they have to survive that long in order to make it. They have really low fecundity. That means that they only produce 2 to 5 eggs per year. They have really low nest success because of predation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. They have fairly high juvenile mortality. That means a lot of youngsters die. But the one thing they do have is low adult mortality. If you can make it to an adult stage, you're probably going to make it, unless someone collects you for the pet trade. So compared to a lot of other species, when we're talking about conservation in the future of bog turtles isn't so much in the young. The future of bog turtles is in the adults, in particular, the adult females. You want them to live as long as possible, to breed as many times as they can, to hopefully roll those dice enough times that at least a couple of their young are going to survive and replace them. Bog turtles are omnivorous. What that means is they feed on both meat and vegetation. Probably one of the biggest part of their diet we see is slugs, but they'll feed on all kinds of things. Most of the sites in Maryland are on private property, and I've gotten to know a lot of landowners pretty well. And a couple of them have planted vegetable gardens pretty close to their bog turtle wetlands. And lo and behold, at least 2 of them have found that bog turtles like eating their cherry tomatoes. I used to, on my own property, when I had gardens, I haven't had any in a few years, box turtles used to always be eating my cantaloupes. That was a pretty common thing. I stopped growing cantaloupes for us to eat. It was just for the wild box turtles that come through the yard. Okay. These are all pictures that Joe McSherry gave me many years ago, and they're all excellent and they're worth using. And they all have to do with nesting with bog turtles. So again, bog turtles, females, late sexual maturity, really small clutch sizes, and they lay in slightly elevated areas, usually either sphagnum mats, the tops of tussock sedges, or any elevated or what we call pedestal vegetation. A friend of mine in New York who's been studying bog turtles for as long as me has a couple wetlands he works at, and the farmer would come down and the edge of the wetland, he'd use a brush hog and he'd mow it. And there was always a concern he was going to be killing some turtles. But what has happened, and it's just kind of interesting how animals can take advantage of things that come up with them, is where the tire tracks went, it kind of raised a ridge of mud right next to it. And that raised area, the turtles took advantage of that and laid their eggs in that raised area. So it's just kind of interesting how life finds a way to get by. Incubation is variable in turtles, usually about 60 days, but it can be short or long. It really depends on what the weather is like during the nesting period. And the nests are really exposed. I mean, the one thing bog turtles have going against them is that they lay their eggs often within sight. If we go back let me see, 1 slide, 2 slides. Oops, I'm going in the wrong direction. This is a picture I took last year at a nest in Carroll County. That's how it looked. I'm above looking down. That's it. So if you're a crow or a blue jay or anything that gets attracted to eggs, this is probably, I'll be very surprised if this nest made it. Anyways. And they typically hatch out in late August or September. They may overwinter at the nest. They may not. Typically, when we find hatchlings in the spring, they're usually right next to where they nested, usually within a couple meters at least. And of course, this picture, Joe, I don't know where you were when you took that picture, but that's pretty amazing shot of one hatching out. Yeah, yeah. There's the egg tooth. I caught a bog turtle about, I guess it was about 24 years ago in Carroll County, Maryland, and it was in April, and it had its umbilical scar and its egg tooth. And I was kind of like, so there's probably at least a few eggs that hatch out the following spring. There's a couple other species we see that in. It's certainly just, it's not the norm at all. But anyways, someone keeps trying to get hold of me. Oh. I thought it might be someone in the studio audience who was razzing me. It's not. It's my wife and daughter. They're razzing me. Anyways, okay. Let's talk about its history in Maryland. So the first record in Maryland is really pretty recent, 1941. That for some of you youngsters, that may seem like ages ago. But for those of us who are older, that's just a blink of an eye. 1940. Now, I was not around in 1941, but it wasn't that long before I was born. Anyways, and that was found along Grave Run in Baltimore County in August of 1941. Over the next 26 years, it was recorded in Carroll, Cecil, and Harford counties, and that is still to this day the range of the turtle in Maryland. In 1972, when the state first enacted the Endangered Species Act for the state of Maryland, it was one of the first species listed, and of one of, I think there were only like 32 endangered species listed at that time, and it was one of the first ones. And at that time, of the 30, excuse me, known sites, it was only still at 17 of them. We call the term we use is extant, which basically means it's still there. So that represented about over a 40% decline in the species right then. So here's kind of what back in 1972, this is kind of how things looked in Maryland for bog turtles. Pretty sparse, not too many. So then in the late 1970s, the Department of Natural Resources under Gary Taylor decided that they really needed to investigate bog turtles. They were an endangered species and really needed to get a better handle on what they were doing. And so what Gary did is he overlaid soil maps with the 30 known sites of bog turtles in Maryland. And he also looked at aerial photos. And what he found was that all the sites that bog turtles were found in were in poorly drained silt loam, such as a soil type there's really three main soil types. And he also noticed that they were in open canopy herbaceous dominated wetlands, so basically grassy wetlands. And so they mapped out 689 wetlands in 6 counties, and they went and visited all of them, usually more than once. Really a tremendous undertaking, if you think about it. I think there's probably some folks in the audience out there who were part of this effort. Really just an amazing effort that went on. And the result from that is, lo and behold, they found bog turtles at 177 sites in those 4 historic counties. So here's what things looked like in 1978. And suddenly Maryland was on the map as having more bog turtle wetlands than anywhere else in the world. In fact, at that time, about 30% of the world population was found in Maryland. And so Taylor concluded that the species was actually more secretive than rare. There were actually a lot out there. They're just really rare. And so it's kind of a case of bean counting, and there's some danger in that. And we'll see that in a few minutes. But regardless, in 1982, the state removed it from Maryland's endangered species list, so it lost the protection it had had up until that point. So then I got hired, and I came on, and early in my career, and I started with DNR in 1989, and I had a lot of folks in the herpetological community, including I think Joe and a couple other folks, come up to me and said, "Hey, you really need to relook at this bog turtle. There's a lot of threats to this species. It's losing habitat. It's being illegally collected. There's a lot of wetland violations going on and things like that. So you really need to go back and look at this." So we got a grant. We hired a couple of folks to work with me, but we really mobilized a team of citizen scientists. And what you're going to see tonight is a lot of my talk. Citizen scientists have really made a big difference in conservation for bog turtles and other species. And I've been able to use them throughout my whole career to really achieve a lot as a group, what one person could not achieve by themselves. Anyways, this team of citizen scientists surveyed 159 of those 177 wetlands in the in the early 1990s, and we did 3 or 4 presence-absence surveys per site, and we also did visual encounter surveys, and we probed and modeled for turtles. There's nothing flashy about it. You're just walking around looking for turtles and then shoving your hands down in the mud and trying to find them. Down south, they also use sticks for probing for them. We tried that early on and really didn't like the results of it and had some complaints from landowners to stop doing that. But anyways, our surveys back then were conducted from mid-April to early July. And that was based on the work that was done by Taylor et al. And also, what is her name who did her master's? I'm drawing a blank. Anyways, the results of our work were 91 of those 159 sites still had bog turtles in them. And That represented about a 43% decline from 1978. So here's kind of what the results looked. Again, we have the blue are ones that still had turtles, the red, they were no longer there, and the black, we were denied permission by the landowners to survey them. So the end result of this is it was relisted as a state threatened in 1995. And based on work in Maryland and work that was done in New Jersey that found the exact same thing that we found, and also some declines in other states like New York and Pennsylvania, it was federally listed as threatened in 1997. So where are we today? So we have continued doing these surveys, and every year we amass a bunch of citizen scientists. We also have what we call site adoption teams. These are folks who are usually environmental consultants who have to meet some rigorous training and rigorous criteria to be on these teams. And they go out and survey sites. And I go out and do a lot of surveys myself, and to keep track of sites and monitor how they're doing, and also in many cases doing some type of management of those sites. So what have we found? Well, since they were first found in Maryland in 1941 to today, they have been found at 209 different individual wetlands in Maryland. That's a lot, and you see that and you go, wow, why are they endangered? There are a lot, but we can talk a little bit more about that. So we know they're still at about 46% of those sites, and so that's 96 sites. That sounds like a lot, but we'll get into that in a minute. They've been completely extirpated from 15 sites, so a little bit over 7%. These sites are gone. 14.5% of the sites are historical. And what that means is that bog turtles haven't been found in 30 years, even though we have done extensive surveys. We just can't find turtles at them. There's sites that we call unknown unlikely. These are sites that we haven't found any turtles at in 30 years. We've done a lot of surveys, but it doesn't meet the criteria for the amount of effort that we're supposed to have done, but they're unlikely to have them. We really only have a little bit over 17% of these sites. So we have a real question as to whether or not they're still there or not. We just don't know. Those are the sites the landowners will not let us on the site. So now here comes some heavy duty data, but bear with me. This is a table. So you saw those 96 sites, but if you look at those 96 sites, there's only 15 sites that we have been able to get enough data on the populations to even put together a table like this. All the other sites are a turtle here, a turtle there, 5 turtles, 6 turtles, 2 turtles. All those other sites are on their way to being extirpated. They're all on a freight train to be extirpated. And even the best populations, we only have 15 sites in Maryland that we consider our best populations. Some of them have a real problem. So there was a PhD study that was done by Shoemaker and was published maybe about 10 years ago. And he did a lot of modeling of populations. And he found that you have to have at least 15 adult females in a population for that population to see remain stable or even grow over time. And if we look at this data, here's the site, CA17, only 12 females. CE41 only has, just barely makes it. CE120 only has 10. So let's talk about a couple of these sites. Oh, and the other thing that we look at, so this is called population demographics. We want to find out how many adult males there are, how many adult females there are, and how many juveniles. You're going to see this unknown adult. These are animals that we caught as juveniles. If they're still alive today, they're adults. We just don't know their gender. We don't know if they're males or females. A lot of these probably aren't still alive. They probably were taken by predators. But anyways, that's why these numbers here are probably a little bit inflated. But let's look at a couple of sites. We'll start with this one here in Cecil County. So this site, we've caught 29 individual turtles. We have 15 females, only 5 males, 4 animals that we don't know if they're adult or not. They should be adults now, but they may not be alive, and only 5 juveniles. This is a site that's just barely hanging on by its turtle toenail, so to speak. This site here, only 10 adult females, but otherwise it looks pretty good. And this is a pretty good number. 18 juveniles. That's a pretty strong number. Look at some of these sites though. This is probably the best site in Maryland right now. 126 animals caught, and big chunk of them are juveniles. So we have some really good reproduction going on at those sites, and a lot of animals. But all the ones in red here are all sites that are in trouble. So look at this site. More turtles than any other site in Maryland. Why is that in red? Well, I'm going to be telling you a story in a few minutes about how this site got blown out by a storm, and we couldn't find turtles here for 2 years, and now there might be 6 or 8 turtles left at this site. And it's a story that needs to be told because it's a really bad story, and it may be a fate of a lot of bog turtle sites in the future. These ones in blue I put in here because these are recent. There are some positive things. So through the environmental review process, I get to review all different kinds of things: development projects, forestry projects, solar projects, stream restoration projects. This site in here, which I'm going to go into more detail, was a stream restoration project. We didn't know it existed. Went out to the site. Habitat looked really good. We made them hire a professional bog turtle person, what we call a qualified bog turtle surveyor, QBTS. That qualified bog turtle surveyor, in his very first survey, in the first 5 minutes, caught 2, and he caught a bunch of turtles. We went back and surveyed it. So far we've marked, and this is only in 3 years, we've marked 30 individuals. Doesn't meet the criteria yet. There are some problems with the site, but it usually takes quite a few years of heavy duty surveys to really get this number. So this is still a tentative number. This site here is another really interesting site. I surveyed it in 1992, found a few turtles and left. Hadn't been back since because the landowner would not let us on it. Same landowner comes to us 2 years ago, and he has his site in a conservation easement, but he got dinged by the federal agriculture folks because he had allowed a lot of invasive plants to take over parts of the wetland, and he wasn't doing any control effort, and that was part of his easement. Well, he had heard through the grapevine, and he heard correctly, that we would come out to wetlands and remove invasive vegetation. We have a grant for doing that. So he contacted us, and we said, okay, we'll do that, but you need to let us survey it to see if it's really worth our time, to see if the turtles are still there. So on our first visit to the site, we found 22 turtles. Second visit, we found like 24. And anyways, this is just from 3 visits. This is just 3 surveys a couple of years ago. Actually, it was last. 58 individual turtles. This site is doing really well. My guess is it's going to end up, when we're done, it's going to end up in this rate. So there are some sites that are still doing really well. They are the exception. They are the exception by all means. So what's going on with these sites? Well, if I had taken the time to put the data together, we would have a really small block right here. We have seen over the history of these sites in Maryland, the proportion of them that are being grazed has reduced dramatically. So what effects has that? And as I mentioned earlier, we know that light to moderate grazing helps maintain fen habitat, these open grassy areas. Heavy grazing is not good, but light to moderate is good. So when you stop grazing a site, if there is no other kind of disturbance at that site, it grows up in a lot of woody vegetation. Red maple, here's a native species, but it likes taking over these sites and just turning them into red maple swamps. That's kind of the natural climax community for this, for these areas. And so we do a lot of red maple removal from sites. That's a lot of chainsaw work and injecting trees with herbicide and things like that. A non-native species, multiflora rosa, Rosa multiflora, has taken over a lot of sites. I actually this afternoon was looking at a wetland in Baltimore County. We were asked to look at it. And as I was approaching the wetland, the woods were full of red maple and multiflora rose and skunk cabbage. It was just like those 3 species were dominating the whole place. And it was like, well, there may or may not be turtles there. We're going to do some surveys to determine if bog turtles exist at that site, but they're not going to be there for long if we don't do a lot of vegetation management. Last but not least, I mean, there's a lot of other invasive species, but of the big 3, reed canary grass is a real problem at a lot of these sites. It will just take over the wetland. And in fact, we found out the Natural Resource Conservation Service was actually, up until a few years ago, was including this species, paying to actually have it planted as a wet pasture type of species. So what else is going on at these bog turtle wetlands to cause declines? Well, the hydrology of the sites is being altered, or has been altered historically, through drainage ditches, through filling of wetlands, through turning the wetlands into ponds, through putting in drain tiles. See a lot of this throughout Maryland. Direct and indirect effects of development. Roads are major fragments of these bog turtle wetlands, and they can be roads that can be a quarter-mile away, but if they're completely acting as almost like a fence, a living fence to keep turtles from moving across the landscape, they're a real problem. Development, here's a bog turtle wetland in Cecil County with a house right next to it. Turtles no longer reside here. In fact, this wetland is pretty much gone. I took this picture about 20 years ago. A couple things going on here. We have runoff coming from the house. If its septic system may be leaking into this thing. If they're putting out food for their dogs, they're going to be attracting human subsidized predators like raccoons and foxes. And I put these two pictures here. A person named Nathan Byer, he's now a professor, I think at a university in Arizona. He was in Wisconsin for a while, but he did a study in Maryland, radio telemetry study on bog turtles. And one of the things he found that one of the major predators of bog turtle nests in Maryland were small mammals and ants, which is really kind of, we all thought that these two were probably raccoons were the worst, and they are bad, but these play a role in nest predation. Disease and parasites, back in 2012, 2013, in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, a lot of bog turtles showed up dead. In some cases, like a midden full of dead bog turtles, and it created a big stir. And so in 2013 and 2014, there was a big effort throughout the range to do disease screening for bog turtles. And the results from it were really inconclusive. The one thing we have noticed in Maryland, and they've noticed elsewhere, is we see a lot of turtles missing digits and having a loss of pigment, particularly on their legs and feet. I actually always thought that this is probably from frostbite, and I have to say I still think it's from frostbite. Because if you look at where bog turtles overwinter, in a lot of cases, it's a really precarious situation. And all it takes is a drop in water temperature, or really, really cold temperatures, and these animals are at risk. I'm currently working on a wood turtle project. In fact, I've been in the field for most of the last 2 months, and wood turtles are a cousin of bog turtles. And at certain populations, we see a lot of animals missing their front limbs. And first we thought it might be predation from something like a mink or an otter, but the more and more we're thinking about it and looking at it, we think it's actually animals that overwintered and picked a bad spot, or in one case, it's a stream that just doesn't have a lot of good places for them to overwinter. And they are exposed to some really bad temperatures in a bad winter. And so they're losing the digits closest to the surface of the water. Illegal collecting and global black market pet trade. This is a huge problem for turtles everywhere. It's a huge problem in Maryland. There's a big effort going on nationally and internationally to help stop this. Turtle species just cannot sustain harvest. The population biology, it takes a long time for them to replace themselves, just cannot sustain harvest. In Maryland, there's only one species that's still harvested commercially, and that's the snapping turtle, and that's only in non-tidal waters. And it's questionable whether or not that species even is sustainable for harvest, even though it does produce a lot of young. Oh, and one, let me go back to this. Oops, I'm heading in the wrong direction. And you know, I find it really frustrating. I've put 30 years into conservation of this particular species, and we have purchased properties, we've put conservation easements on them, we've done lots of vegetation management, and then in one night, one person can destroy that. One greedy person can destroy it. Climate change. Climate change is not, it's here, it's now, and it's affecting us in so many ways. It's affecting you and I today, now. it's affecting bog turtles too. So since the 1980s, it's been noted in Maryland, maybe even since the 1970s, that lots of storms, the severity of storms increases because of there's so much impervious surface on the landscape. And by impervious surface, I mean development. If you think about the landscape, before development, it's like a sponge, soaks up a lot of rainwater, and the water that comes off of that is the energies are severely reduced. If you think about development, it's like a tabletop. It's as if I took this water bottle and poured the water on this tabletop. The water just goes off with lots of energy. And so what we've seen with an increasing severity and frequency of extreme storms is that the development that we've already done is working in a negative synchronicity with climate change to cause some real problems. This is a bog turtle wetland that had probably more bog turtles caught in it than any other place in Maryland over the last 30 years. And here's what it looked like in June 2015, looking really, really, really good. We had a 100-year storm in August of 2018. This became that. I found pieces of the sod 6 feet up in trees. Entire alders, entire shrubs were moved 30 feet. This particular storm actually killed a person about within 10 miles of this site. Was swept right off the road and into the water and was killed. Now this site today, this is slowly filling in with vegetation, but this used to be the heart of where all the bog turtles were. They're gone. For 2 years after this, we could not find a bog turtle in this wetland. And this wetland extends over an area much bigger than what this photograph shows. We couldn't find a bog turtle here anywhere. And then 2 years ago, one live one was found and one dead one that a predator, probably a raccoon or a mink, had gotten hold of. And then last year we trapped it, and we were going to trap it the year before, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't. So we trapped it last year, and the day we were putting out traps, we caught 2, including a new juvenile, which was a good sign. And during the course of trapping, we caught 5 individual animals. So there's at least 6 or 7 animals there now. We're hoping it gets recolonized over the next couple of decades from surrounding areas and builds up through breeding. But it's I shed a few tears the day after when I came out the day after the storm. It was bad news. So we have a 2-scale conservation strategy in Maryland, and actually I think most states are doing this, and the federal government. We have a site level conservation strategy where we do things like control of woody and invasive vegetation, grazing management. We try to restore the hydrology. We establish or maintain adequate buffers, and we utilize different federal assistance programs, and also buy conservation easements. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or the Old Soil Conservation Service, through their wetland reserve program, has really bought a lot of conservation easements in Maryland. MALF easements, the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Fund has been used to buy a lot of easements of bog turtle sites, really the entire farm, so they at least can't be developed. So there's been a lot of, I'm going to say about 70% of the bog turtle sites in Maryland have at least some form of protection on them. Most of the easements are imperfect because there's no specific bog turtle language in them, but they are keeping the farms from becoming housing developments in the next Walmart. So that's a good thing. The other level of conservation is at the metapopulation or watershed level. And here we're really trying to maintain linkages, either create linkages or maintain them between adjacent wetlands. And a lot of the stream buffer and stream restoration projects that have gone on have at least a little bit of this, though there's some negatives to stream restoration, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we have done a lot at the site level. We have been much less successful at the larger scale level. There have been 4 coordinated groups that have been working on this in Maryland: Department of Natural Resources, who I work for, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which used to be the Old Soil Conservation Service, and believe it or not, Maryland State Highway Administration has really played a really critical role in this. If you think about all those roads out there, they're at least responsible for the state ones, and they also have some pretty deep pockets to help out with some conservation efforts. And a lot of the things we do fencing, either fencing livestock, fencing bog turtles to keep them from going into roads, habitat restoration and management, invasive vegetation control, grazing management, and then easement and acquisition. And because almost, I guess about 95% of the sites in Maryland are privately owned, landowners are really a critical part of the whole thing. So we've done some really interesting conservation grazing with goats, which has been kind of fun. They escape a lot, and there can be some real husbandry issues with them, but that's been interesting. We have not been able to do this on a large enough scale to really have meaning on the landscape. On individual sites, it's worked really well, but we really don't have the capacity right now to do this in a large scale. A lot of invasive vegetation management. Here we're mainly attacking multiflora rose, a couple acres of it, and I wish I included an after photograph, because this site ended up being just a wonderful fen wetland after we removed the multiflora rose. We've done a lot of cattail removal. In fact, the last couple of years, we've done more cattail removal than anything. And so cattail is a native species, but it can just take over sites. Here you can see this is all cattail, this entire area. And this is a site we've been cutting and treating for a couple of years now. And this is in July of 2020. Here's the morning picture. Here's later in the day after we're done. We've opened up this. And one thing we've noticed is that this gives the native vegetation, particularly the native sedges and rushes, a little competitive advantage to really germinate and take off in these areas. We've done a handful of prescribed burns at bog turtle sites. We haven't done.
Hold on, I'll see what's going on. Joe, there's no sound. We have no sound. I'm trying to contact them at headquarters to see what's going on. Stay tuned. Sorry about this.
Testing.
Hello? I think they're trying to fix the situation that just happened.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yep,
Okay.
we got you.
Yeah. So, anyways, this is a really cool project, and we have found a huge population of bog turtles, as well as 18 other species of herps at this site besides bog turtles. So one of the parts of my job is that is maybe not as much fun is doing environmental review, reviewing all those projects. But sometimes it gives us an opportunity to infuse some science and use that to help inform management. And one part of environmental review for bog turtles is we use these qualified bog turtle surveyors. Their role is to, if it's a site that we think is suitable habitat, well, they may be the ones who determine it's suitable habitat, and then they may be the ones who are hired by a firm to go out and do what we call phase 2 surveys to see if turtles are there, or trapping surveys, which we call phase 3 surveys. So they have a really critical role in all of this. And it's qualified bog turtle surveyors, or QBTS is the acronym for them, that we actually use as part of our site adoption teams, which is a program we have where we give 2 sites to a team every year to survey. They have to do a minimum of 4 surveys at sites, and we give them one good site and one site we don't know the status of, and that's how over time we get a better idea what's going on with sites. Okay, so this is a site where a stream restoration was promoted. We weren't involved in it. We didn't know anything about bog turtles at this site, and the qualified bog turtle surveyor was required to map all the wetlands at this site and assess their suitability for bog turtles, because it was in an area of the state that has a lot of bog turtle wetlands. And lo and behold, he found this wetland right here. And he said, you know, that was really good habitat. And I came out and I concurred, and I said, in fact, looking at the site, I said, you're going to find bog turtles immediately. He did surveys and found 2 turtles in a couple minutes and ended up finding a bunch of turtles. This is the site where 30 turtles are found. So initially the stream restoration was going to include this stream from here to here, and it was going to be including a lot of areas. Because of them finding that turtles, and we required a radiotelemetry project to be done. So transmitters were put on 11 bog turtles, 7 females and 4 males. That's what we could catch. And we tracked them. And these are all the locations where turtles were found. We discovered that turtles were going off site. We also discovered there were 2 little wetland patches we didn't even know about, where turtles were not only using, 3 of them overwintered up here. A bunch of them overwintered here, here, and here. So we had them change where they were doing the stream restoration. We also use this as an opportunity to learn a little bit about what effect the construction using heavy equipment would have on overwintering bog turtles. So we put out temperature data loggers at 3 sites in the wetland, and these included, I think I have pictures of them. These included an above ground, right at bog turtle level, temperature data logger, and one down below ground. It was attached to this PVC pipe about 6 inches below in a tunnel where groundwater was flowing through naturally in these sites. We put temperature data loggers on bog turtles and the transmitters. And these temperature data loggers would collect data every 2 hours, both in the controls and on the turtles. And we would also get GPS locations of the turtles every 2 weeks. We would, starting in mid-October, we'd flag each successive location because we're trying to figure out where they're overwintering. And we put game cameras out to monitor the construction activities when it was going on, and also to provide some security in case someone decided to come onto the site and poach turtles. And this is where the data gets a little bit more harder to. So if we look at the red, this is the air temperature. We knew the air temperature would fluctuate the most in the site. The blue is the water temperature. We knew that would fluctuate a lot less than the air temperature, and it did. The greenish yellow is turtle, and this is a summation of all the turtles we had transmitted. Construction at this site took place from here to here. Hibernation started, and in this site it was very interesting. Hibernation, they all started hibernating on the same date. We had this big cold spell on the 5th, and by the 6th, everybody was hibernating. They were in the hibernacle they used that year. for the rest of the winter. And hibernation ended at different times for different turtles, somewhere between April 1st and April 7th. One thing we noted from this is that turtles did not seem to be disturbed by the construction. We had no one left their hibernacula and went to somewhere else or went out in the ice and snow and died. So that was a good thing. We found that hibernation length was 148 days, plus or minus 2.5 days. And we saw that the temperature of the bog turtles was directly correlated with the temperature of the water, which is what we expected, but it's kind of nice to see the science back that up. Okay, so enough science. I just have 2 more slides, and they're kind of fun slides because everybody likes to see turtles, particularly turtles that are a little bit different than the norm. These are turtles that over the last 30 years we've caught that had whitish or pinkish neck patches from at least 3 different counties. These ones are interesting. They're just very narrow, like horns almost. These are some pretty big solid ones. These are big solid. These are actually had a little orangish hue, but they're really light colored. These are clearly white, and these are almost totally white. There's only one paper in the scientific literature about white neck patches, and it was just from one animal. We need to publish this. We haven't yet, but it's kind of cool thing about the turtles. One other interesting thing is the shell itself. We see kyphosis in turtles, which is basically a curvature of the spine. This was an excessive. This is a kyphotic male. This is an old male at a site. We called him lumpy. The landowner called him humpy because every time he saw him, he was mounting one of the females there. He was a really old timer. His shell was smooth. We had him. We took him to the Baltimore Zoo, Maryland Zoo, and had him X-rayed. And here's kind of what things look like. Since this turtle was the most extreme of this, but we found probably about a dozen turtles in 30 years that have this. It's just kind of an interesting thing to note. Some of you folks who breed turtles out there may have seen something like this. I don't know. Shell anomalies. This you probably have seen. We see this in a lot of turtles. There are certain sites where it seems to be much more common. In this case, we have a split or extra vertebral scoop. You see going down. There's typically 5 vertebrals, and here we have 6. And these pleural or costal scutes are a little bit altered. Sometimes most turtles have 12 marginal scutes on the right and 12 on the left. Sometimes we'll see 12 on one side, 13 on another, 11, 11, 11 and 12. So there's a lot of different theories for this. One is an injury early in development. Another is different incubation temperatures that vary dramatically during incubation. Another is human or animal farm drugs getting in through urine or feces in the site through septic systems, or if the cows or whatever are being given certain types of chemicals and the animals are exposed to that. And then lastly, it could just be genetics. It could be there's a lot of shell abnormalities or shell anomalies in certain populations. But it is an interesting thing that we see. I've been working with wood turtles now for the last 2 years heavily, and maybe the last 3.5 or 4 years. And we rarely see shell anomalies in wood turtles. I see it much more in bog turtles. 2 completely different systems, but just throw that out there. And last but not least, I just want to end this with acknowledging a whole bunch of people. And there's probably a lot of people missing from this, but Craig worked for me for quite a few years. He's going on to bigger and better things. Julie Slacum has really been at the controls for this for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for decades now. And really a lot of the conservation efforts that have happened in Maryland, she has played a behind the scenes big role, whether it's through funding or other things. Beth Schlimm is going to be replacing me. She's been heavily involved in Maryland since 2016 and is really kind of now running the bog turtle program. She is due to have her first baby May 15th, and she may have had it today for all I know. But anyways, Beth will be replacing me. I'm retiring in the next year, probably in January. And she's a very capable, in fact, more than capable. And a whole bunch of people, I spelled Kevin wrong. Sorry about that, Kevin Keat. and organizations. We've probably used actually more close to 1,000 citizen scientists over the last 30 years. And of course, we have some amazing landowners. So anyways, that is all I want to talk about. Here's my conservation, excuse me, my, excuse me, contact information. I work out of the Y Mills office over on the shore. There's my office number and my email. And I want to thank you again for having me. I don't know if we have time for questions, or if we can do questions through this. Do I leave this on? Okay.
No, let's unshare. No, we're going to go back and show you as a human being, and we'll do questions.
You want me to repeat the question? Okay.
So we have okay.
You know, I'm glad you asked that question. The question is, do bog turtles tend to hibernate singly or in multiple? And so I meant to cover this in my talk and I completely forgot to. So I'm glad you asked the question. It depends on the site. Some sites where we think hibernacula are limiting, we see large numbers of turtles altogether. 19 is the most I've counted. A lot of times you'll see just maybe a pair together, two together. It might be a male and female, and it might be ones that are gonna, they're gonna mate first thing, like as soon as they come out of the hibernacula in April, they're mating. It's like, but other times there's large groups, but 19 is the most we've had together. Some other researchers have had more. It seems like the sites where they're more diffuse hibernacula, where it's either turtles all by themselves or only with like one or two other turtles, we think those sites hibernacula are not limiting. Where we see lots of them together, it's really probably it's survival. I mean, it's really for survival. And so one thing we haven't done is we haven't looked at injuries like missing digits to see if there's any relationship between that and large hibernacula versus single hibernacula. Great question. Go ahead. Yeah, so skewed sex ratios is a sign of a problem. That's one thing we look at. You really want 50% male, 50% females. Now, males may travel more than the females. Females you think would be more at risk to predation because of nesting. They tend to nest. They're a diurnal turtle. They nest during the day, but I know Nathan Byer did his master's degree and studied two populations in Maryland for 2 years. And I think he found a lot of the nesting occurred at dusk, like, in the later part of the day. Some turtles, wood turtles, people have found they nest more in the morning. But anyways, very few turtles are nesting at night except for sea turtles. Most of them are diurnal. And your question, skewed sex ratios, there does seem to be differential mortality in males at some sites. And we're not 100% sure why that is. They tend to be more active earlier. It could be they're more exposed to predation than the females are. That could be part of it. But we really don't know. But there definitely is skewed sex ratios. Yeah, I can pull up if I can.
I have a question for the field.
Let me pull up that slide and let's take a quick look at that. There we go. Yeah, so and so this could be, I mean, luckily they're polygamous. So one male will mate with a lot of females. And of course, you guys may or may not know this, but in most turtle species that we know of, females can store the sperm of more than one male for up to like 4 years plus. And typically a clutch of eggs, the paternity of that clutch is more than one male. And there's a lot of evolutionary reasons for that. It's actually really cool if you think about it. It's really pretty amazing. But yeah, I mean, here's a close to 50-50 sex ratio. This site, by the way, Craig Nine, who worked for me and did his master's on bog turtles, he did population modeling at this site, and this site was gonna crash. I mean, this site was not going to be here in the future because of the demographics. It was he did population viability analysis, PVA analysis, and it was I think they do like 100 iterations or 1,000, and it was always like this. Yeah, 0 juveniles, right? Exactly. So this site is still there, but if you saw where it was on the landscape and what's happened to the surrounding area, it really, I hate to say it, but it's a site that's probably going to be extirpated in the lifetime of the turtles that are there right now. On the other hand, this site here, PVAs, you look at that data, you're saying, wow, that site is doing great. That's the site that got hammered by that storm and is down to like 7 turtles. This is why I cry. I really did have when I first saw that, I couldn't help but shed a tear. It hit me in the gut about as hard as you can. You know, some of these other ones, here's close to 50-50 ratio, but you know, there's a lot of, the thing that's going on here, there's a lot of juveniles. So there's something happening here. Maybe we haven't caught all the females. This data goes up to 2021, except for some of this data. There is some data on here that it is pre-pandemic. Oh yeah. So bog turtle wetlands tend to be fairly closed systems. I mean, a lot of the models that are used for population models, the assumptions are closed systems, and actually bog turtles meet that pretty good. Compared to I'm working with wood turtles, those are completely open systems. There's turtles going back and forth. Now, if I just put up here the population estimates we got from mark recapture, that might tell a different story, but you wouldn't have the sex ratios or the age ratios. So both are really important. In fact, this table would be better, and I actually did this in another report. I just didn't put it here. Estimated population size based on mark recapture. And so we go and do, I have found that if you do 8 surveys, like if we did 4 last year and 4 this year, we get pretty good mark recapture data that you can get a really good population estimate with fairly low standard errors. And that looks pretty good for bog turtles at sites where you get recaptures. At sites that the populations are really, really low, you know, you're probably catching all you have. The other thing about this table, and I didn't mention earlier, is that many of these sites, we feel we have caught the entire population. We have caught and marked the entire adult population. The only new turtles we're getting are juveniles. You know, a lot of it's really hard to catch young turtles, and so you may not catch them until they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old because they've escaped detection for all those years. They're really hard to find, and that's why we have this big thing. So this is all about 20 years worth of data. For this site here, this is, let me think, 134. This is just before that storm. So this is through 2015. Now that looks a lot different. But again, we're talking about animals that don't move a lot. Their home, I should have mentioned this earlier, most of their home ranges are measured in square meters. They're not measured in acres. There's only a few animals there's always a couple animals that are the ones that are responsible for genetic flow, gene flow, but the majority of these animals have really small home ranges. I mean, unbelievably small. We've done some I actually threw out a couple slides to make the talk shorter, and it didn't work. But anyways, I had some slides that is a couple animals that we actually had radios on for 3 years and showed where they went in 3 years. And it's, you know, the same habitats, the same hibernacula every year, often overwintering with the same turtles every year. I'd really like just the social, no one's really studied the social structures of bog turtles. They have for wood turtles. The social structures of bog turtles is really, really interesting. I think it's very similar to wood turtles. It's probably a dominance hierarchy. Yeah. Yeah. How do we catch them? Okay, there's a couple ways to catch them. One is to walk through a wetland and just visually look for them. That's called a visual encounter survey. Another one is to model or probe, and that is to really get on your hands and knees and shove your hands down into the mud and catch them. The third is trapping them. I actually also deleted those slides on trapping too to make this shorter, and it didn't work. Anyways, go ahead. So I can give you a long answer. Back in the 90s, okay, the question was, are there any captive breeding programs for bog turtles? Back in the 1990s, we began a captive breeding program cooperative with what was then the Baltimore Zoo. And through some really bad luck and a little bit of human error, but mostly bad luck, that effort failed. We realized at that time that to really do a successful breeding program, it was going to take a large investment of money and time and facilities, and we needed to find the money, and we didn't find the money. Now, folks down south, there's Zoo Atlanta and some folks in Tennessee really did some really extensive breeding work and have been able to establish at least one good population in Tennessee through this. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has shown increased interest in the last couple of years in revisiting this and actually funding some breeding and on a large scale. But we'll see what happens. You know, money talks. So it's needed. It's certainly a tool in the toolbox that has to be used. That should be used. The thing is that, you know, if you captive breed and you release animals, the Head Start turtles, if you haven't addressed the reasons why they decline in the first place at those areas, you are wasting your money. You are wasting a lot of effort. So you really first need to understand, why did that population fail? What was going on there? And if you don't address that, you're really wasting your time. And the question is predation by raccoons. It is a problem. In fact, so when I first got into this field, I was very against predator control. I really thought it was old school, and we'd grown way beyond that. And then I got into the real world and really began looking at the effect that elevated populations of predators like raccoons were having on rare species like bog turtles. And it was pretty clear that predation is playing a really major role in declines at many sites. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, we helped direct one of their trappers to a number of bog turtle sites. And over a series of years, he trapped primarily raccoons, but also a couple other species. And what he found was that in year one of trapping a site, he caught a lot of raccoons. And he trapped in the spring. If you trap in the fall, you're really not doing anything to the population. If you trap in the spring, you're knocking back that population, at least temporarily. So he trapped them real hard year one. Year two, he usually caught a much smaller percentage of animals. By year three, he was having almost no success because he trapped out most of the raccoons from that area. And what we saw by monitoring the population was we suddenly saw big gluts in cohorts of juveniles. So predator control works, but it only works if you do it. And if you do it at some periodicity. So every 5 years, if you were to go in and trap these sites and really try to hammer the raccoons, and you might need to do it 2 years in a row, it would really help a lot of these sites, because many of these sites, predation is the reason why they're crashing. And people have problems with that, and I understand that. I mean, you're catching raccoons and you're killing them. There's no way to sugarcoat that. So we play God. We play God. Will bog turtles double clutch eggs? That's probably a better question to ask a breeder. I will say this: we have found some clutches of eggs in the wild that reminded me of waterfowl dump nests. I've seen some clutches of like 12 to 15 eggs. In fact, another photo that I didn't include in my talk because it was getting too long was a clutch of about 15 eggs. And that was probably 2 or 3 females all dropping their eggs at the same spot. I know a fellow researcher in New York State has seen quite a bit of that. Whether it's young females that don't know what they're doing, or why do waterfowl do it? Why do ducks dump nests where you see 30 eggs together in one dumped in one spot? Is there an evolutionary advantage to that? I have to say I haven't read enough on the subject to answer that question well. The question is, where do the turtles lay the eggs? Is it always on the top of a tussock, or does it? They can bury things. Sphagnum mats are a really great place for them to nest because they can kind of hide the eggs, even though they're just barely hidden, because you have this warm, moist environment. Our site that has the most breeding going on, CA140, 41 young. There's huge sphagnum mats there, and when we survey that site, this is a actively grazed site. The cattle, the one place the cattle can't get to is where the sphagnum mats are, which is just sheer luck, because the mud's too deep in the areas around them. And we go there and we find so many young. It's like, it's just, and a lot of these are hatchlings. And so what you really want to see is a lot of 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds. This 41 is probably, I'm going to guess about 30 of those are hatchlings. Did those hatchlings survive? We don't know, I mean, some of them did, but a lot of them probably didn't. So, other questions? Go ahead. Sure. The question is, how can someone get involved? We do take on volunteers to help with surveys. We require people to send us a resume with 3 references. It's almost like you're applying for a job. The reason we do that is we really only want people who are really serious about doing this, because out with us, and it gives us an opportunity to test by talking to references, find out, is this someone who's a poacher who's just trying to get an in with us or not? Because these are really sensitive sites. We require everybody who comes out with us to sign a confidentiality statement. They also sign a DNR volunteer form. And actually, one of the positives of this is all the work we do is through grants, and we need to generate non-federal match dollars for those grants. And we can use anybody who's a volunteer with us. We can use their hours traveling to the site, surveying with us, and driving home. We can use those hours, and we actually record it, and we have sheets for all that. So if you were to give me an email and we're interested in coming out with us, we would scrutinize you. We'd probably get the FBI to check you out. Just kidding. But we are very careful, because all it would take was to bring one wrong person to a site. And I'm not saying that we haven't done that, because I think we probably have over the years trusted a few people that we should not have trusted. So it's we scrutinize people, and some people are like, well, I'm not going to give you a resume if you just want me to volunteer, but okay, then you must not be really serious about it. So that's kind of, and you would need to have hip boots or plan on getting really muddy, and our days can be really long, and they're a lot of fun, but they can be long, and you might not find anything. We collect a lot of negative data. All those sites that turtles weren't found at, we had to painstakingly survey them, in some cases trap the heck out of them. And trapping is a 20-day endeavor of just the trapping and then setting things up. And trapping is a pain in the butt. And so we only do it when we really have to. And but all that data I showed earlier about where is it? This data here, really the status of this, about 3/4 of the sites we have done we have done massive amount of effort. And even these sites, we've done at least some effort. The only sites we haven't done the effort at is these sites right here. So this is years and years and years of many people. This isn't just Scott, it's a lot of people. One last question. Okay. The question is, why is the range just in the northeast quarter of Maryland? Why doesn't it extend farther? That is a really good question. So a few years ago, I got involved with some soil scientists, and they did some modeling for us. And the best way for me to answer that question would be to show some of that stuff up on here, but I can't. It has a lot to do with underlying geology. So underlying geology generates soils, and there clearly appears to be areas in Maryland that should have bog turtles that don't. They should be in Montgomery County. They're not. We have spotted turtles down there. We have some spotted turtles that don't have spots, but they're spotted turtles, but they should be in Montgomery County. They're not. They probably should be in eastern Frederick County. We haven't been able to find them. They're in a couple creeks that flow towards the Monocacy River. We think those actually are animals that crossed over the watershed boundaries. I didn't mention the genetic work that's been done, and some genetic work we did a long time ago found that about 1 to 3 animals were crossing over watershed boundaries every generation. So probably the Monocacy and Potomac drainage was actually colonized by overland movements, not through stream movements, which is kind of interesting. Is that about it? Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, audience out there.
Thank you.
This off.